Have you ever begged God to take something away, only for heaven to seem silent? What if one of the greatest apostles experienced exactly the same thing? We often think unanswered prayers mean weak faith, but Scripture tells the story of a man whose faith was extraordinary and whose prayer was still answered with silence. That man was Paul, the apostle who planted churches, performed miracles, and endured imaginable suffering. Yet there was one burden he desperately wanted God to remove. In 2 Corinthians 12:8, Paul writes, "3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me." 3 desperate prayers from one of God's greatest servants. But the Bible never tells us what Paul's thorn actually was. Was it sickness, persecution, poor eyesight, or something else entirely? Scripture simply doesn't say. Maybe that's intentional. If the Bible named Paul's thorn, we'd compare ours to his. Instead, God left it unnamed so every believer could see their own struggle in it. Then God finally answered, not by removing the thorn, but by speaking. In 2 Corinthians 12:9, he said, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness." But God's answer wasn't, "Paul, I'll remove it." His answer was far more surprising. God chose to leave the thorn and strengthen the man carrying it. That's completely opposite to what most of us pray for. We ask God to change our circumstances, but sometimes God begins by changing us. Paul didn't stop believing because God said no. Instead, he declared, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me." So maybe unanswered prayer isn't always God's rejection. Sometimes it's his invitation to discover a strength you never knew his grace could provide. So maybe unanswered prayer isn't always God's rejection. Sometimes it's his invitation to discover a strength you never knew his grace could provide. Paul even went further. In 2 Corinthians 12:10, he wrote, "For when I am weak, then I am strong." That wasn't denial, it was a faith transformed by God's grace. If God had removed Paul's thorn, he might have gained comfort. But sometimes God's greatest miracles don't happen around us, they happen within us. So maybe the real miracle wasn't that Paul became stronger. The real miracle was that God's grace became greater than the burden Paul carried every single day. So what if the answer you've been waiting for isn't a miracle that changes your situation? What if it's the grace that changes the person living through it? Paul never tells us the thorn disappeared, but he does show us something greater, a life that discovered God's strength was enough, even when the weakness remained. And this wasn't just true for Paul. Isaiah 40:29 says, "He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak." God may not always remove the burden, but he never withholds the strength to. Maybe faith was never about pretending the burden wasn't heavy. Maybe faith is discovering that even under its weight, you are not carrying it alone. Because sometimes God's answer is not the removal of every struggle. Sometimes his answer is the strength, the patience, and the peace he gives us while we walk through it. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson of Paul's story. Not that every thorn disappears, but that even with the thorn, grace can still be enough.